HOA Karen called 911 on me for being disabled and wearing a hijab in my own front yard. It was a perfect spring morning when everything fell apart. Amina was in her front yard, tending to her garden as she did most mornings since moving into the Oak Ridge Heights neighborhood 2 months ago. The spinal cord injury she'd sustained 5 years ago meant she relied on her wheelchair for mobility, but she had adapted her gardening techniques with specialized tools and raised beds that made it possible for her to pursue her passion. Today, she wore her favorite emerald green hijab, its soft fabric framing her face while providing the modest covering that was an essential expression of her Muslim faith. The lightweight material was perfect for gardening, breathable enough for the physical work yet secure enough to stay in place as she leaned forward to tend her plants. Amina had always found a special peace in gardening while observing her religious practices. It was a form of devotion in itself, caring for Allah's creation. She was carefully pruning her lavender plants, enjoying how the morning sunlight cast dappled shadows through the young maple tree she'd planted when she first moved in, when a shrill voice cut through her peaceful morning. "Excuse me. Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Amina turned her wheelchair to see a woman marching toward her property line. She recognized her from the HOA meetings, Karen Wilson, who somehow managed to find violations in everyone's homes except her own. "Good morning," Amina replied calmly, setting down her specialized ergonomic garden shears that accommodated her limited hand dexterity. "I'm just tending to my garden." Karen's face was flushed with what appeared to be rehearsed outrage. Her eyes darted from Amina's wheelchair to her hijab, making little effort to hide her disdain for both. "That bench isn't approved by the HOA guidelines, and those plants aren't on the approved vegetation list. You need to remove them immediately." The bench she referred to was a small, decorative seating area Amina had installed specifically to help with her mobility needs, a place to rest when transferring between her chair and the garden. "Actually, I submitted the modification forms last month," Amina explained, adjusting her position slightly to ease the pressure on her lower back. "The bench is considered a reasonable accommodation under—" "I don't care what you call it," Karen interrupted, her voice rising. "And frankly, your appearance is making neighbors uncomfortable. This isn't that kind of neighborhood." Amina felt her heart race as she realized what Karen meant. Her hijab. Her disability. "I have every right to be in my own yard," Amina said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "There's nothing in the HOA guidelines about religious attire." Karen pulled out her phone. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the authorities. There's a suspicious person who doesn't belong here causing a disturbance." Amina couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're calling 911 because I'm gardening in my hijab? On my own property?" "I'm protecting our neighborhood values," Karen snapped as she dialed, turning slightly away from Amina. "Yes, emergency?" "There's an unauthorized person in the Oak Ridge Heights community," she spoke into the phone, her voice performatively panicked. "She's making changes to property without approval and refusing to leave when confronted. I don't recognize her from our neighborhood. She looks suspicious." As neighbors began to peek out their windows and doors at the commotion, Amina felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. 2 months of building a life here, of carefully creating her accessible sanctuary, and now she was being treated like an intruder in her own home, all because of her hijab and her disability. Little did Karen know that her impulsive call would set in motion a chain of events that would change their neighborhood forever. In the tense minutes that followed Karen's 911 call, Amina felt as though time had slowed to an excruciating crawl. She remained in her garden, hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what was happening. Her peaceful morning had transformed into a public spectacle, with several neighbors now watching from porches and windows. "I've lived here for 2 months, Amina said, her voice stronger now as indignation began to replace shock. "I own this house. You can't call the police on me for existing in my own yard." Karen's face remained set in righteous certainty. "We'll let the authorities sort this out. If you have nothing to hide, you shouldn't be worried." From next door, Amina's neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez emerged, drawn by the commotion. She was still wearing her bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, concern etched on her face. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, looking between Amina and Karen. "This woman is calling the police because I'm gardening while Muslim and disabled," Amina explained, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened in disbelief. "Karen, have you lost your mind? Amina is our neighbor. She moved in 2 months ago. I brought her a casserole." Karen's posture stiffened. "She's making unauthorized modifications to her property. The bench, these plants, none of it was approved by the HOA. So you called 911? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice rose in pitch. for a gardening dispute? More neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Mr. Walker, a retired school principal from across the street, approached with a concerned expression. "I heard someone called the police," he said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. "What's the emergency?" Before Karen could answer, the distinct sound of police sirens became audible in the distance. Amina's chest tightened with anxiety. Despite knowing she had done nothing wrong, encounters with the police as a visibly Muslim woman with a disability had not always been positive experiences for her. "Please," Amina said quietly to Mrs. Rodriguez, "can you stay with me until they arrive?" Mrs. Rodriguez immediately moved to Amina's side. "Of course I will. This is ridiculous." The police cruiser rounded the corner and pulled up in front of Amina's house. Two officers stepped out, a middle-aged white man with graying temples and a younger black woman. They approached with measured caution, assessing the scene before them. A group of neighbors gathered around a woman in a wheelchair wearing a hijab in her front yard. "We received a call about a disturbance," the male officer stated, looking between the gathered neighbors. "What's going on here?" Karen stepped forward immediately. "I'm Karen Wilson, HOA Compliance Committee. This woman is making unauthorized modifications to her property and refused to stop when confronted." She gestured toward Amina with a sweep of her hand. The female officer looked at Amina. "Ma'am, do you live here?" "Yes, officer. My name is Amina Rahman. I've owned this house for 2 months. Amina's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "I was gardening in my front yard when Ms. Wilson confronted me about my bench and plants, then called 911 claiming I was suspicious and didn't belong here." Mrs. Rodriguez interjected. "I can confirm she's my next-door neighbor. There's absolutely no disturbance here except the one Karen is causing." Mr. Walker nodded in agreement. "I've seen Ms. Rahman gardening here regularly since she moved in. She's a peaceful neighbor." The male officer turned to Karen with a skeptical expression. "So there's no emergency here? Just a dispute over garden features." Karen's confidence seemed to waver slightly under the officer's gaze. "She's violating HOA guidelines and her appearance is concerning to some residents." "Her appearance?" the female officer repeated, her tone sharp. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The tension in the air thickened as Karen realized she'd said too much. Amina watched as the officers exchanged a knowing glance. "Ma'am," the male officer addressed Karen directly, "calling emergency services for non-emergencies is a misuse of police resources. HOA disputes should be handled through proper channels, not by calling 911. The female officer stepped closer to Amina. "Ms. Rahman, are you all right? Do you need anything from us?" Amina felt the first sense of relief since the confrontation began. "I'm just shaken. I was simply gardening in my own yard." As the officers continued to assess the situation, more neighbors had gathered, forming a protective semicircle around Amina. The community was watching, listening, and beginning to understand exactly what kind of person Karen Wilson truly was. The female officer, whose nameplate read, Officer Diaz, knelt down beside Amina's wheelchair to speak with her at eye level. The simple gesture of respect wasn't lost on Amina or the gathering neighbors. "Ms. Rahman, I'm going to need to see your ID just to document this call, but I want to be clear that you've done nothing wrong here," Officer Diaz said quietly. Amina nodded, reaching carefully into the small bag attached to her wheelchair. "My wallet is in here," she explained, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. Meanwhile, the male officer, Officer Peterson, had moved Karen several feet away and was speaking to her in low, serious tones. Though they couldn't hear the exact words, Karen's face was gradually transforming from righteous indignation to uncomfortable realization. "Here's my driver's license and my mortgage paperwork," Amina said, handing the documents to Officer Diaz. "I keep a copy with me because things like this have happened before." Officer Diaz's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry that's been your experience, Ms. Rahman. This shouldn't happen to anyone in their own home." She quickly examined the documents and returned them with a nod. "Everything is in order as we expected." By now the crowd of neighbors had grown to nearly a dozen people. Mrs. Rodriguez still stood protectively near Amina, while others whispered among themselves, many casting disapproving glances toward Karen. Officer Peterson returned with Karen, whose earlier confidence had visibly deflated. "Ms. Wilson," he announced in a voice intentionally loud enough for the gathered neighbors to hear, "I've explained to you that misuse of emergency services is a serious offense. Calling 911 for non-emergency matters like HOA disputes diverts resources from genuine emergencies." "But Karen began. "Furthermore," Officer Peterson continued firmly. If your call was motivated by Ms. Rahman's religious attire or her disability, that could potentially constitute harassment based on protected characteristics. Do you understand the seriousness of these actions? Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I was just trying to enforce the HOA guidelines. Officer Diaz stood up. HOA disputes are civil matters, not criminal ones. They should be addressed through your homeowners association procedures, not by calling emergency services. She pulled out a small notepad. I'm documenting this incident, and I need to inform you that false reports can result in fines or more serious consequences. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered neighbors. Mr. Walker stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative from his years as a principal. Officers, as a longtime resident of this community, I want to formally express that Ms. Rahman has been nothing but a positive addition to our neighborhood. Her garden is beautiful, and this confrontation does not represent how most of us feel. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. An older woman that Amina recognized as Mrs. Chen from the end of the block raised her voice. I'm on the HOA board, and I can confirm that Amina submitted proper paperwork for her garden modifications weeks ago. They were approved under accessibility accommodations. Karen is not the final authority on HOA matters, despite what she seems to believe. Karen's face flushed red. You didn't notify me of that approval, Margaret. I don't need to notify you personally of every board decision, Karen. You're just a committee member, not the board president, Mrs. Chin replied coolly. Officer Peterson turned to address the gathered crowd. Folks, we appreciate your concern for your neighbor. This appears to be a misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily. We'll be documenting this incident, but there's no criminal matter here. He turned specifically to Karen. However, I strongly advise against making similar calls in the future without a genuine emergency. Amina felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, not from fear or humiliation now, but from the unexpected support of her neighbors. She had worried for so long about finding acceptance in a new community, and now, in this terrible moment, she was discovering it in the most unexpected way. Officer Diaz leaned down once more. Ms. Rahman, would you like to file a formal complaint about this incident? Amina took a deep breath, looking at Karen's now deflated posture, then at the supportive faces surrounding her. Not at this time, officer. I think today has been educational for everyone involved. As the officers prepared to leave, having determined there was no emergency, the neighborhood's attention turned fully to Karen, who stood alone at the edge of Amina's property, the consequences of her actions becoming increasingly clear in the disapproving eyes of her neighbors. What had begun as a terrible morning was transforming into something unexpected, a moment of community solidarity that Amina would never forget. By that evening, news of the incident had spread throughout the entire Oak Ridge Heights community. Amina had retreated inside her house after the police left, emotionally drained from the morning's events. She sat by her living room window, gazing out at her partially completed garden, wondering if she would ever feel the same peace there again. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Cautiously, she wheeled to the door and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw not one person, but at least a dozen neighbors standing on her front porch and spilling into the yard. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the front, holding what appeared to be a casserole dish. Amina opened the door, confusion and wariness evident on her face. We hope we're not intruding, Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. But we wanted to show you that what happened today is not who we are as a community. We're ashamed of how you were treated, added Mr. Walker, standing just behind her. And we wanted to make it right. Amina looked past them to see neighbors she recognized and some she hadn't yet met. Many carried dishes of food, plants, and small gifts. In the yard, several men were already kneeling by her garden beds, continuing the planting she had left unfinished. We thought you might not feel like gardening right now, explained Mrs. Chin, gesturing toward the men working. But we didn't want your plants to wither in their pots. Tears welled in Amina's eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. After what happened, we had an impromptu neighborhood meeting. Everyone was horrified by Karen's behavior. Mr. Walker cleared his throat. The HOA board has called an emergency session for tomorrow. Karen has been suspended from the compliance committee pending a formal review. And, added Mrs. Chen with a small smile, we're drafting new guidelines to explicitly protect religious expression and accessibility accommodations in our community bylaws, so nothing like this can happen again. A young woman stepped forward whom Amina hadn't met before. I'm Sophia from down the street. I'm an attorney, and I'd like to offer my services pro bono if you decide to pursue any legal action. What happened to you was discriminatory and wrong." Amina was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. "Please come inside," she managed to say, backing her wheelchair to make room for everyone to enter. For the next few hours, Amina's house was filled with neighbors introducing themselves, sharing food and expressing their support. Children ran through the yard, helping with the garden planting under the supervision of their parents. Inside, conversations flowed about community improvements, accessibility awareness, and cultural exchange. Mrs. Rodriguez sat beside Amina as they watched the activity. "Karen doesn't represent us," she said firmly. "Most of us moved to this neighborhood because we wanted diversity and community. Her views are dying out even if they sometimes feel very loud." "I was so afraid after what happened," Amina admitted. "I've faced discrimination before but never so publicly, never at my own home." "Your home is your sanctuary," Mrs. Chin said, joining them. "And we want you to feel safe here. The board president asked me to personally apologize for what happened and to assure you that formal action will be taken." As evening approached, the gathering showed no signs of dispersing. Someone had brought out lawn chairs, and a few neighbors had set up a small grill in the communal area near Amina's yard. Children were playing tag while their parents chatted, creating the atmosphere of an impromptu block party. Amina wheeled herself to the edge of her porch, observing the scene with wonderment. Her garden was now fully planted, looking even more beautiful than she had envisioned. Her neighbors had added solar-powered pathway lights along her accessible walkway and installed a small wind chime near her bench. Mr. Walker approached, holding a mug of tea. "We've started a neighborhood watch program," he informed her. "Not to police who belongs here, but to ensure everyone feels safe, especially those who might be targeted unfairly." As the sun began to set, someone suggested a group photo. Neighbors gathered around Amina in her garden, surrounding her with support both literal and symbolic. As the camera timer counted down, Amina felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The morning's humiliation was being transformed into something powerful, a community standing together against intolerance. Later that night, after everyone had gone home with promises to return soon, Amina sat in her garden under the stars. The day had begun with cruelty but ended with kindness. Her phone buzzed with notifications as neighbors added her to the community group chat and sent messages of support. Tomorrow would bring the HOA meeting and formal consequences for Karen, but tonight, Amina felt something she hadn't fully experienced since moving in. She felt at home. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. the following evening in the community center. Amina arrived 20 minutes early, her nerves evident as she adjusted her hijab and positioned her wheelchair at the table near the front. Despite the overwhelming support she had received, the prospect of facing Karen again, and in such a formal setting, made her stomach clench with anxiety. Mrs. Chin and Mr. Walker had offered to pick her up, but Amina had insisted on driving herself. This was her battle to face, even with allies beside her. The room filled quickly, with nearly triple the usual attendance for HOA meetings. Neighbors nodded respectfully to Amina as they entered, many stopping briefly to offer quiet words of encouragement. She noticed several unfamiliar faces, residents who typically avoided HOA politics but had been drawn out by yesterday's events. At precisely 7 p.m., the HOA president, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Abernathy, called the meeting to order. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she surveyed the packed room. "Before we address the incident that prompted this emergency session, I want to make one thing perfectly clear," Mrs. Abernathy began, her voice carrying authority. "Oak Ridge Heights was founded on principles of community, respect and dignity for all residents. Any actions that violate these principles will not be tolerated." Amina scanned the room, finally spotting Karen in the back corner. Unlike her usual confident demeanor, she sat with shoulders hunched, her husband beside her looking deeply uncomfortable. "Yesterday morning," Mrs. Abernathy continued, "an incident occurred involving Ms. Amina Rahman and Ms. Karen Wilson that resulted in law enforcement being called to our community unnecessarily. The board has reviewed statements from witnesses, the police report, and our own HOA bylaws." She paused, removing her glasses. "Ms. Rahman, would you like to address the community regarding your experience?" All eyes turned to Amina. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had prepared what she wanted to say, practiced it throughout the day, but now faced with dozens of attentive faces, she decided to speak from the heart instead. "I moved to Oak Ridge Heights because I wanted to be part of a community," Amina began, her voice initially soft but growing stronger. "As someone with a disability, finding an accessible home was challenging. As a Muslim woman who wears hijab, finding a place where I feel safe and accepted can be even more difficult. She glanced toward Karen, who avoided eye contact. Yesterday, I was made to feel like an intruder in my own home. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because of who I am, a Muslim woman with a disability. Being labeled suspicious in my own front yard, having the police called on me for simply existing in my own space. Her voice wavered slightly. It was dehumanizing. Murmurs of support rippled through the audience. But what happened afterward showed me the true character of this neighborhood, Amina continued, emotion coloring her words. The way you all rallied around me, stood up for me, welcomed me into your homes and hearts, that meant everything. It turned one of the worst days of my life into one that ultimately reinforced my faith in community and humanity. She looked directly at Karen now. I don't want punishment or revenge. What I want is understanding, education, and change, so this never happens to anyone else in our community again. As Amina finished, spontaneous applause broke out. Mrs. Abernathy waited for it to subside before turning her attention to Karen. Ms. Wilson, would you like to address the community? Karen rose slowly, her usual confidence notably absent. She began, then faltered. Her husband squeezed her hand encouragingly. I made a terrible mistake. I let my biases about how a neighbor should look or what accommodations are appropriate, cloud my judgment. I abused my position on the compliance committee and caused harm to Ms. Rahman and our community's reputation. She looked directly at Amina for the first time. I am truly sorry for what I did. There's no excuse for my behavior. Mrs. Abernathy nodded, then addressed the room. The board has made the following decisions. First, Ms. Wilson is permanently removed from the compliance committee. Murmurs of approval followed this announcement. Second, she will be required to complete community service hours with the local Interfaith Coalition and Disability Advocacy Group. Karen nodded, accepting the consequences without protest. Third, Mrs. Abernathy continued, we are amending our HOA bylaws to explicitly protect religious expression and to streamline approval of accessibility modifications. No resident should ever feel unwelcome or unsafe in their own home based on their faith, ability, or appearance. Mrs. Chin stood up. I'd like to propose something additional. Our community has clearly been lacking in education about diverse faiths and disability awareness. I suggest we organize monthly community education events, starting with an open house at our local mosque and a workshop on accessibility needs. The proposal was met with enthusiastic agreement. Even Karen's husband raised his hand to volunteer help with organizing. As the meeting progressed to discussing the practical aspects of these changes, Amina felt a profound sense of validation. What had begun as a traumatic incident had catalyzed meaningful change in her community. The garden that Karen had found so objectionable would now become a gathering place for neighbors to learn about each other's cultures and needs. After the meeting concluded, Mrs. Abernathy approached Amina. I want you to know that the board is taking this very seriously. We've reported the incident to the Regional HOA Council as a cautionary example for other communities. As Amina prepared to leave, she was surprised to see Karen timidly approach her, without the committee clipboard she usually carried like a shield. Ms. Rahman, Amina, Karen said hesitantly, I know words aren't enough, but I am truly sorry. I've never had to confront my own prejudices so directly before. If you're willing, I'd like to learn from you. Amina studied Karen's face, searching for sincerity and finding it. Healing takes time, she replied carefully. But education is always a good place to start. As she wheeled herself out of the community center, neighbors falling into step beside her, Amina felt the first real sense of belonging since moving to Oak Ridge Heights. Her garden, the very space that had been the battleground, would now become a symbol of change, growth, and community healing. 3 months after what the neighborhood now referred to simply as the incident, Amina's front yard had transformed. What began as a modest garden had blossomed into a community gathering space, with her accessible pathways now extended to create a small seating area where neighbors regularly stopped by to chat, share gardening tips, or simply enjoy the peaceful atmosphere. Today was special, the official unveiling of the Unity Garden, a project that had grown out of the aftermath of Karen's 911 call. The neighborhood had come together to expand Amina's personal garden into a community space that celebrated diversity, accessibility, and belonging. Amina adjusted her wheelchair beside the refreshment table, watching as neighbors began to arrive. Her emerald green hijab, the same one she'd worn on that fateful day, was now complemented by a corsage of lavender and rosemary, scents that filled the garden. Nervous? Mrs. Rodriguez asked, placing a tray of homemade empanadas on the table. A little, Amina admitted. I never expected to become the center of attention when I moved here. Sometimes the most important change comes from the most difficult moments, Mrs. Rodriguez replied with a warm smile. The garden itself had been transformed. Alongside Amina's original plantings, neighbors had contributed plants that reflected their own cultural heritages: Korean spice viburnum from Mrs. Chin, Mexican sage from the Rodriguez family, Italian herbs from the Bianchi brothers down the street. Each plant bore a small, weather-resistant tag explaining its cultural significance and who had contributed it. The pathways had been widened to accommodate wheelchairs, walkers, and strollers with ease. Braille plant identifiers had been added for Mr. Jameson, who was visually impaired. The bench that Karen had once objected to so vehemently had been joined by several others, creating conversation areas throughout the space. Mrs. Abernathy approached, clipboard in hand but with a warm smile that made it clear this was no inspection. Everything's ready, Amina. The press is here as well. Amina nodded, still slightly uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing the importance of sharing their story. The local newspaper had asked to cover the garden unveiling as part of a series on community initiatives promoting inclusion. As the crowd gathered, Amina noticed a familiar figure on the periphery. Karen stood slightly apart from the others, holding a potted plant and looking uncertain. In the months since the HOA meeting, Karen had been quietly making amends, volunteering at the local mosque's food pantry, attending disability awareness workshops, and gradually reintegrating into community events with a notably changed demeanor. Amina wheeled herself over. I'm glad you came, she said simply. Karen offered a hesitant smile. I brought this for the garden, she said, holding out a potted olive tree. It's a symbol of peace in many cultures. I thought it might be appropriate. Amina nodded, accepting both the plant and the gesture it represented. We'll find the perfect spot for it. Mrs. Abernathy called everyone's attention for the brief ceremony. Standing beside Amina, she addressed the gathered neighbors and press. When we create barriers instead of bridges, we all lose something valuable, she began. What happened in our community earlier this year could have divided us. Instead, it brought us together in ways we never expected. Amina was asked to say a few words. As she positioned her wheelchair to face the crowd, she felt a profound sense of how far they had all come. This garden began as my personal sanctuary, she said, her voice clear and confident. Now it belongs to all of us. Every plant, every path, every bench represents our commitment to creating a community where everyone belongs. She gestured to the vibrant space around them. The Unity Garden isn't just about plants. It's about growing understanding, cultivating respect, and nurturing belonging. What happened to me was painful, but look at what has blossomed from that pain. As the ceremonial ribbon was cut, opening the garden officially to the community, Amina caught sight of Officers Diaz and Peterson at the back of the crowd. They had stopped by periodically to check on her over the past months, and Officer Diaz had even joined the Community Education Committee. The afternoon unfolded with food, conversation, and community bonding. Children played hide-and-seek among the taller plants while adults gathered in conversation circles throughout the garden. The reporter moved through the crowd, collecting stories about how the incident had sparked change throughout Oak Ridge Heights. As evening approached and the gathering began to wind down, Amina found a quiet moment alone in the garden. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the plants, and the gentle breeze carried the mingled scents of herbs and flowers. From this spot, she could see her house, the home she had worried might never truly feel like her own after that terrible morning. Mr. Walker approached, carrying a cup of tea. Penny, for your thoughts? Amina smiled. I was just thinking about belonging. How something as simple as a garden can become so much more. He nodded thoughtfully. You know, in my 40 years of living here, I've never seen the neighborhood so united. Sometimes it takes a mirror being held up to show us what we don't want to see about ourselves. And sometimes, Amina added, it takes one person being brave enough to stand their ground to create change. As stars began to appear in the twilight sky, Amina wheeled along the smooth pathways of the Unity Garden, touching plants gently as she passed. The garden that had once been the site of humiliation and fear had transformed into something beautiful and healing, not just for her but for an entire community. The journey wasn't over. True change never happened overnight. But as Amina looked at Karen carefully watering the olive tree she had contributed, at children from diverse backgrounds playing together among the plants, at neighbors exchanging recipes and stories across cultures and generations, she knew that they were growing something far more important than flowers. They were growing understanding, one garden bed at a time.